Much blowing of trumpets in Westminster today, the Deputy Prime Minister promised that Britain will meet its legally binding targets for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. They are, after all, legally binding. They also happen to be manifesto commitments. To be fair, the government promises to do much better than the targets, but environmentalists are increasingly wondering whether a commitment to meet the existing targets is anything like radical enough to save the planet. It's not, after all, as if there aren't plenty of things we could do more. It looks an ordinary house, it is an ordinary house, but Dr. Jeremy Leggett's transformed this corner of southwest London into Britain's first domestic power station. Dr. Leggett replaced his roof tiles with high-tech solar panels generating electricity even during dreary afternoons in March.
So the wires from the tiles come to these boxes. They're called inverters because they change the direct current into alternating current. And as you can see, even in the dull light of the late afternoon, they're all generating electricity.
He sees no reason why his house couldn't become the norm. They do look like ordinary tiles, actually, don't they? In fact, a mere 100 metres down the road, his company, Solar Century, sells the electricity-producing tiles to homes across the country. But while saving the environment may be good for your conscience, it's hardly soft on your pocket. What period of time would you estimate is necessary to recoup the investment?
If things stay as they are, then it's the lifetime of the system before you can get your money back, and clearly not many people are going to be...
That's 20 years or something, is it?
20, 30 years.
Well, people move house on average every 10 years.
Yeah, well, this is why you need a reason to be a pioneer. But, you know, to focus on that and ignore what is going to happen, and I say it's going to happen because of what the Germans and the Japanese are doing to build their own markets, the price is going to come down, and ultimately, all buildings are going to be power stations.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could I have a box of electricity, please?
Economy or family size electricity?
But you don't have to turn your home into a power station to feel as green as Dr. Leggett. Since 1998, full deregulation of the electricity supply market means the consumer can choose how green his electricity producer is. If you don't want to use electricity made by burning coal, gas or oil, you don't have to. A new breed of specialist electricity supplier has now joined the market. For a premium, anyone, anywhere in England and Wales, can buy guaranteed eco-friendly power.
We felt that to a certain extent a lot of concentration had been made on the generation and technology side in UK and in Europe. And we wanted to create a market so that it wasn't actually just put on the tomorrow's world type of shelf, that renewables actually were possible, they did exist now, and they could supply energy to individuals throughout the country.
Despite Unity's emergence, renewable energy sources still only command a fraction of the whole market. 16% across the EU as a whole, and only 3% in the UK. Of that 3%, 56% is hydro, 13% landfill, waste burning is 22%, and potentially the most productive source of alternative energy, wind, only accounts for 9%. The government, in its defence, points to its climate change levy to be introduced next year. This will hit industrial users of carbon dioxide emitting energy. But while it may encourage industrial use of renewables, it won't make any impact in the domestic market, which is completely excluded from the new tax. So the future of renewable energy use by consumers isn't exactly being helped by the government. Whereas in Germany, all users of electricity pay towards a levy which goes to subsidize renewable use, in the UK there are no official incentives.
The government has a huge opportunity to live up to its rhetoric in the solar energy field. It could put solar on many of its own buildings cost effectively and set an example. Instead, what it has chosen to do is do the easily achievable and then crow, as we've seen today, about how wonderful it's being in dealing with the dreadful challenge of global warming.
So perhaps the government could take a leaf out of Dr. Leggett's book. If it did, Westminster's most historic buildings might be sporting a revolutionary look. Now we're joined by Nick Goodall, who's of the British Wind Energy Association, and Martin O'Neill, Labour MP and Chair of the Trade and Industry Select Committee. Nick Goodall, do you think that Britain's going to meet its target by 2010 of 10% of energy coming from renewable sources?
We should do. There's certainly the resource. The questions are whether the policies that are presently being put in place will actually deliver that.
Yeah,
and that's our real concern.
That was my question. Do you think we will?
I don't think we will unless we see much firmer policies regarding particularly planning for achieving the sectors of wind and certainly biomass.
Martin O'Neill, there was a House of Lords Select Committee report last year which threw serious doubt on whether these targets will be met. What's your own view?
I think that the government has made a start in the sense that it has identified areas in business use of energy that can be reduced. I think it's now got to get into the business of providing appropriate financial support for renewables and targeting particular areas where we can get quick movement and I think not quite easy gains, but gains which will enable people to recognize that renewables have a substantial contribution to make.
Well, that must be music to your ears, isn't it?
It sounds fantastic, but what we've seen now with the emergence of the new government policy is pretty much the abandoning of these new technologies, particularly areas like offshore wind, where we're leaving them now to the vagaries of the market. Instead of taking the opportunity, as we've seen in most other European countries, where there's direct government support for emerging technologies, now we have a percentage obligation on suppliers to emerge, which is a good thing. But of course, if we can't generate at the very lowest cost, these technologies just simply won't be built.
Martin O'Neill, you accept there will have to be a great deal of government incentive?
I think there'll have to be incentive, and it's interesting you use that word rather than support, because there are problems within the European Union about subsidies of the old style. But I think that we have a tradition in the UK through things like the non-fossil fuel obligation, where we can provide means of support.
But the non-fossil fuel obligation was one of the few things that was emphatically stated in the conclusions document the Energy Minister has just announced, that there will not be any more non-fossil fuel obligation support for renewables.
No, but I think what the government is saying is that there will be support for renewables, and we have a tradition of supporting them. I realise
it has to be. I mean, we have to go up sevenfold in order to meet these targets, Martin O'Neill.
Yeah, that's true, Jeremy. But the fact is that in the UK, we've never had to worry about this. We've had, under the old system, ample supplies of coal, we've had gas from the North Sea, we've had nuclear power, but a number of these are no longer acceptable. But we've not had the tradition of the Netherlands or Denmark, for example,
what
to
kind of
support
excuse is that?
Well, it's quite a substantial excuse, because hitherto, when we've never been conscious of our obligations to the rest of the planet, we've been able to resolve our own energy problems. I think today's statement is quite clear that we are part of a bigger world and we have to respond to that. And I think that the nature of the response will be in varying ways of supporting the new technologies which can provide the pathway to renewable energy in the UK.
Other countries have taken a much more pragmatic approach to it than this. They've seen there are distinct economic advantages in developing indigenous renewable energy industries. That's why we see Denmark with 13,000 people directly employed in wind energy. That's why in Germany last year we saw 1,569 megawatts of wind built, whereas in the UK we saw a measly 20. And that's on the background of the UK having the greatest wind resource of any European country.
Yeah, but you know the opposition there is to putting up these things in beautiful parts of the country.
Irrespective of the comments that a few people make about onshore wind, offshore wind has no opposition at all. Yet the government has chosen to strand without apparent new support for offshore wind in a way that historically we've seen NOFO support, and in an expectation that the market will emerge and that these projects will be built. And yet within the government's very own breakdown of how that 10% will be achieved, offshore wind is the most substantial slug.
Okay, thank you both very much. Tomorrow morning's front pages.